Government at the federal, state, and local level developed hundreds of little programs intended to encourage more people to buy homes, thereby channeling more artificial demand into the housing sector. Developers constantly get handouts, free land, new roads, and tax privileges to build homes, even if, as is happening in far-out suburbs these days, nobody wants to buy them. The tax code is the most obvious example. The federal government takes anywhere up to 35% of a worker's income, in addition to Social Security and Medicare taxes, unless he engages in certain activities. Invest in the stock market through an IRA or 401k, and you can shield some of the money from the tax man. Pay premiums to a health insurance company through your employer, and you can deduct that money. The biggest deduction for most families is the home mortgage interest deduction. Renters and people who buy a home outright without taking out a mortgage don't get to write off their housing costs come tax day. Government introduces strong incentives to buy instead of rent, and to borrow heavily in order to buy. Okay, so what this is talking about is that government is using the tax code to encourage people to do certain behaviors, to make certain decisions in their lives. So one of the things that the tax code does is, or up until recently, you could donate money to a charity and then you could write that off in your taxes, in your federal taxes. And your taxable income, the amount of money that the government can tax, would drop because of that. So that could drop you into a lower tax bracket. By putting money into your retirement account, either an IRA or 401k, that also drops your taxable income maybe to another level so that you pay less to the government every April 15th. Well, one of the biggest ones is the home mortgage interest deduction. What this means again is that if you go out and finance, if you go out and borrow money for a house, then you're eligible for this tax credit. So again, you can take any mortgage interest that you pay over that year and you can deduct that amount from your taxable income. Okay? So again, what this is doing is that if you have enough of these deductions, you can drop yourself into a lower tax bracket. That means that the last dollar that you are taxed on, instead of being at, say, 30%, might be at 25%. But again, what this does is it artificially distorts the markets because it encourages people to go out and buy homes that maybe they can't afford. And in some cases, people are looking at it because of the tax benefits. Okay? The other part of this is, think about what this is all about. You go out and you borrow money, you get a tax deduction. If you were to go out and buy that house with cash, you don't get a deduction. Okay? You buy it with cash, you are going to be paying the same amount on your taxes the next year that you would have been paying if you hadn't bought that house. So you can see how it's trying to alter behavior, but only to a certain point. You don't get the benefit if you do the really, really bright, intelligent thing and buy the house outright. You only get it if you put yourself into debt. Moving on to the next paragraph. There are countless little provisions like this. First-time home buyers in Washington, D.C., for instance, receive a $5,000 tax credit. More significant is the special treatment accorded to a home as an investment. If you buy $500,000 in stock or buy a business worth that much and sell it 10 years later for $1 million, you're going to pay capital gains taxes, which back in 2008 were 15%. Thanks to a 1997 law, if a couple bought a house for $500,000 and sold it for $1 million, they would pay no capital gains on that. So we'll break this down a little bit. If you were to buy this house for $500,000 and you made $500,000 on it, then you would owe the government $75,000 without this special tax break. But if you were to go out and buy $500,000 worth of stock, and that stock went up by $500,000, you then owe the government that $75,000 in capital gains. So what it does is it de-incentivizes you to invest money in the stock market, and it incentivizes you to go out and buy a house. We see this in other places as well. If you go out and buy an electric car, you might get something like an $8,000 subsidy. So you can basically knock off $8,000 of that car's value when you go to buy it. So the government's going to pay $8,000 of the cost of that electric car. That's at least the way it used to be. This is not to suggest that any of these tax breaks are undesirable or should be repealed. A tax break is an oasis of freedom to be broadened, not a loophole to be closed. Instead, they should be extended to as many other kinds of purchases as possible in order to not provide artificial stimulus to any one sector of the economy. So what Woods is saying is, rather than have these little carve-outs all over the place, make carve-outs everywhere, okay? And what this is going to do is it's not going to have money being diverted for artificial reasons to different sectors of the economy. It'll be more spread out, and therefore it'll look more like the actual market would if we didn't have any of this in place to begin with. As true and important as all this is, though, these factors by themselves cannot account for the sheer scope of the housing bubble and the depth of the crash. To understand the housing boom and bust, we need to understand why business cycles occur. While conventional wisdom tells us that these booms and busts just happen, that conclusion lets government and its central bank off the hook. Austrian economics, which we'll discuss in more depth in Chapter 4, explains how business cycles occur, specifically how government tinkering with the supply of money and credit starts the economy on an unsustainable boom that has to end in a bust. When the Federal Reserve pushes down interest rates by increasing the money supply, it encourages a boom in the production of relatively longer-term projects, raw materials, construction, and capital goods in general. The boom in construction and real estate this past decade, made possible by these low interest rates, is a good example. So what he's talking about is usually during times of economic recession or depression, you're going to see interest rates drop. And interest rates are going to drop. This would be a real response in the market, not just something that's artificially created. Interest rates are going to drop during those times, and what it does is it incentivizes you to go out and work on capital projects. So capital projects are usually building projects. So let's say that you own a restaurant and you need some new stoves or ovens or something like that. And those stoves or ovens are going to cost you, say, $50,000. If you had been looking to buy them during a good economy, interest rates may have been kind of high. And so you've decided not to buy those ovens at that time simply because interest rates are so high and you're going to be paying a lot of interest on them in the future. But what happens during a recession and depression is people tend to start saving money, start putting money away and not spending. And what that does is it helps to drive interest rates down. When interest rates are driven down, that signals to the market, now is a good time to go out and lay down some capital expenditures. So go out and purchase those ovens or stoves because you're going to be paying a lower interest rate on them. What we see the Fed doing is artificially moving interest rates up and down with no regard to how the market would have done that in the first place. Unlike the production that genuine consumer demand stimulates, though, the Fed's artificial stimulus is not in line with real consumer preferences or the current state of the economy's pool of savings. It draws resources away from projects that cater to real consumer demand, and it encourages more and different kinds of projects to be undertaken than the economy can sustain. The necessary resources to complete all these projects profitably do not exist. Neither the saved resources to complete them, nor the consumer base to purchase the finished products exist in sufficient volume. Not enough people want or can afford $500,000 homes, so the prices these homes can fetch are far lower than initially anticipated, and then the bust comes. The Fed, whose mechanics will likewise be explained in a later chapter, started the boom by increasing the money supply through the banking system with the aim and the effect of lowering interest rates. In the wake of September 11th, which came just over a year after the dot-com bust, then Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan sought to reignite the economy through a series of rate cuts, culminating in the extraordinary decision to lower the target federal funds rate, which is, again, the rate at which banks lend to one another overnight and which usually drives other interest rates, to 1% for a full year, from June 2003 until June 2004. In order to bring about this result, the supply of money was increased dramatically during those years, with more dollars being created between 2000 and 2007 than in the rest of the Republic's history. This new money and credit overwhelmingly found its way into the housing market, where artificially lax lending standards made excessive home purchases and speculation in homes seem to many Americans like good financial moves. The Fed also encouraged the GSEs, Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, and Freddie Mac, and the Federal Housing Administration to borrow and lend at levels never before seen. So the already existing campaign to lower lending standards, along with the monopoly privileges enjoyed by the quasi-governmental agencies Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, played a role in channeling into the housing market the new money the Fed was creating. But it was the Fed ultimately that made the artificial boom in housing possible in the first place. And it was all the new money it created that gave the biggest stimulus to the unnatural rise in housing prices. So I want to give you guys a little bit of background on all of this. In the 1990s, we saw a period starting in about the mid-90s when computers, personal computers, the internet, there was a big boom in all of that. So people started getting personal computers in their homes, which was very, very rare before about 1995. And with those computers also came the internet. Now, as you guys I'm sure have all shopped online through Amazon or some other website, you know that shopping online and doing things online is a very, very popular thing to do. And so you had a bunch of people that were trying to take advantage of this new technology, and they started creating all of these new businesses online. So Amazon, Google, they joined things like Alta Vista and all these other companies that were already online and tried to capitalize on this new boom and try to get advertising dollars and people to buy stuff online from them. But the market became so saturated online that a lot of these companies ended up failing. And because many of them had gone through an IPO, the initial public offering, which is putting their companies into the stock exchange and trying to raise money by having people buy stocks. Well, when these companies failed, a lot of people lost money in these companies that they had invested in. And so this is what we call the dot-com bubble. And the bubble burst right in the year 2000. It was just happened to be an election year. Bill Clinton had been the president throughout this whole dot-com boom. And then the bubble burst, and it was really one of the reasons why Al Gore lost to George W. Bush in that 2000 election. 9 months after George W. Bush becomes president, we had 9/11. Now, none of you guys were alive, or if you were, you would never have remembered this. The economy didn't come to a standstill, not like what we've seen with the pandemic. But there was a time when there were no airplanes flying. People were afraid to go to movie theaters. They were afraid to go to malls because those are what we call soft targets. They were places that had very little security, and there was a lot of fear that terrorists would target those types of places and go after Americans in that way, simply because they would probably be able to get away with it and kill a lot of people very, very quickly. And so you see this recession that develops during the early 2000s because of both the dot-com bust and 9/11 coming quickly one after the other. What the Federal Reserve's response was under Alan Greenspan was to lower the federal funds rate, to lower it to 1%, which means that most interest rates were also going to drop as well, making it easier for people to get easy credit. Then the other part of this is that you have extra money being put into circulation. So you could also have some price inflation as well. Fortunately, the price inflation didn't get out of hand, but we did see a lot of money going into the market. And where did a lot of that money end up in? It ended up in the housing market, which further caused this boom through the mid-2000s in housing. Although speculators are one of the groups the political and media establishments teach us to loathe, there is nothing wrong with speculation in and of itself. In a truly free market, speculation, whether in real estate, commodities, or stocks, performs an important social function, making the economy more efficient by speeding the pace at which prices adjust to coordinate supply and demand. But an easy money policy lures increasingly reckless or ill-prepared investors into the game, and misleads people into thinking a particular investment strategy is a no-lose proposition. If we go back and look at people who wanted to flip houses, a lot of them had no idea what they were doing. But they did see people getting rich off of it, and they decided to quit their jobs and go into that instead. Cheap money draws people into speculation who do not belong there, who know little about the market involved, and who see in it an irresistible get-rich-quick scheme. Remember, if you want to get rich, go slow. Engage in the long game. Invest. Allow your money to work for you. There are no get-rich-quick schemes out there, guys. And in fact, even without the added incentives introduced by new laws and regulations, an easier monetary policy by the Fed in and of itself encourages the lowering of lending standards. When banks lend out the new money created by the Fed, they necessarily lend it to people whom the banks had previously deemed unworthy. It's like the situation a basketball team would face if it added 2 new roster spots. Those spots would go to players who otherwise would have been cut. In an atmosphere of rising prices and general prosperity, it also becomes difficult to distinguish between sound projects and bubble projects. That is, between projects that would make good economic sense during normal times and projects that can survive only if credit remains artificially cheap. Phenomena like these are nothing new. Observers have commented on them throughout American history. In the credit-induced boom from 1914 through 1920, for instance, the same excessive optimism, the same willingness to take on risk, the same artificial stimulus to speculation were all evident. According to Fred Garlock, writing about the situation in Iowa for the Journal of Land and Public Utility Economics in 1926, caution was thrown to the wind by both bankers and their customers. Speculation became rife, an enormous burden of debt was contracted, and the economy was lost in a swirl of extravagance. Garlock explains how it works. Rising prices affected both banks and their customers with an optimism which swept aside the conservative standards of experience and promoted extravagance and speculation. So instead of people being conservative in their investments, instead of people being conservative in the way they spent, they saw other people making lots of money and decided that was the route that they wanted to take as well. So whatever the customers purchased, whether merchandise or land, they were able to sell at an extraordinary profit. Whatever was produced on their farms brought unusual returns. Some few persons, uncertain of what disposition should be made of the unexpected harvest, began reducing their fixed indebtedness. It was not long, however, until the continuously rising prices, the encouragement of the bankers, and the methods used by the government in selling war securities had convinced the majority that debt was a blessing in disguise, as it became progressively easier to liquidate and offered a means of extending profit-making activities. So basically everything out there, government, banks, friends, whomever, were telling you debt is good. Under the urge of these influences, industry expanded and thrived. Promoters of all types came into their own, and thrift gave way to extravagance. Bankers found their accustomed standards of credit and analysis growing obsolete, for values increased automatically with the passing of time. Hence it was that as the speculative fever gained a foothold and grew and the demand for bank funds enlarged, credit was extended to all manner of persons on or without all kinds of security Excess lines became commonplace. Customers' notes given to promoters of questionable and fraudulent enterprises were discounted for rich rewards, and large sums were advanced to land speculators. So the banks began handing out lots of money with nothing to guarantee against default. So you have all sorts of credit out there on the market. People are taking out insane amounts of money. And what's going to happen when that credit bubble bursts? They're going to be stuck holding the bill. They're still going to have to pay the banks back. And what if they can't pay the banks back? Then the banks are not going to have any money, because what have they done with all of their money? They haven't put it in the vault. They've been lending it to other people. What happens when the banks have no money and people go to make withdrawals? Well, that's when you start getting bank runs. And what happens when you get bank runs? That's when banks close. Borrowing for the purpose of relending became an established practice. Time and time again, the banks were saved from the effects of their ill-advised acts by the continuous growth of deposits. This scenario should sound familiar. The same kind of real estate frenzy is evident throughout the history of American business cycles, which is also the history of artificial bank credit expansion, beginning with the Panic of 1819, and they could just as easily be drawn from news reports in 2008 and 2009. As Wood said, these bubbles in real estate are nothing new. In fact, we've seen them in Florida quite often. Let me take you back to the 1920s. If we look at a piece of Florida real estate, we might think beautiful place on a beach, aqua waters, white sand, nothing but sunshine 365 days a year. If we think about what real estate might mean in Florida today, we might think of something near Disney World, where when you get off of work, you can go over to Disney, hang out at the Magic Kingdom, hang out at Disney Springs, just enjoy life. But if we take it back to the 1920s, it meant something completely different. In the 1920s, you had people up in the Midwest and in the Northeast who would take out ads about all of this land in Florida that was there for the taking. And a lot of people bought into this, and they decided to come on down. Well, first problem with Florida during the 1920s and 1930s is there's no air conditioning. And unless you grew up here and are used to the climate, it's something that's really difficult to get accustomed to unless you have an air-conditioned home. Now, the other part of this problem is that Florida is, for all intents and purposes, a swamp. And so that's where we get this idea of land by the gallon. Okay, so you bought land sight unseen through a newspaper ad while you were living in the Midwest or the North. Then you come down to Florida, you get to your plot of land, and it's covered in 3 feet of water. And that is the Florida land rush, the Florida land boom of the 1920s and 1930s.